Hello, and thank you for joining me. Today, as part of our baking challenge series, I take a stab at Kouign-Amann, a famous pastry from Brittany, France. This pastry is actually infamous for how much butter it contains, even being called by some the fattiest pastry in all of Europe. My talented pastry chef friend, who I worked with at John George, put me up to this. Now, this is a complicated pastry, and I'm trained as a savory chef, not as a pastry chef. But the whole idea of the baking challenge is that I approach dishes I've never made before and show you that you are absolutely capable of making them at home. It's going to take some time and some attention to detail, but it's super rewarding in the end. So without further ado, let's get to it. First, we need to make our base dough. Now we have here 500 grams of all-purpose flour, 250 grams of lukewarm water, 30 grams of fresh yeast, or 15 grams if you're using dry active yeast, 10 grams of sugar, 12 grams of salt, another 40 grams of sugar, and 100 grams of cubed butter at room temperature. Whenever I work with yeast, I like to make sure it's good and alive. So before anything, I'm just mixing it with 250 grams of that lukewarm water and that 10 grams of sugar. I let it sit for about 10 minutes, at which point it should be foamy and smelling yeasty. Then I can add everything but the butter to a stand mixer fitted with a dough hook. Mix the ingredients on medium speed for 2 to 3 minutes until the dough comes together. Then, bit by bit, add the room temperature butter to the dough until it is fully incorporated. Now, a lot of recipes out there use a fairly lean base dough that doesn't have much butter, but that's not the case with this version. And I got this recipe from my friend who worked with a great French chef, so I think it's safe to say we're being true to form here. While this dough may look super wet and sticky, don't panic. Wrap it in plastic wrap or place it in a covered, greased metal bowl and let it rest for 8 hours or overnight. Next, we need to make our butter block. The point of this butter block is to ensure some level of precision, so what I'm doing is tracing a rectangle on a sheet of parchment paper. I just imagine the rectangle somewhere in the middle of the piece of paper and go for it, making it 6 by 10 inches or 15 by 25 centimeters. And for the butter in question, I have here 250 grams of butter that has been out of the fridge for a little while but isn't very soft, and all I'm going to do is whip that until the appearance changes from matted to waxy. Now flip that piece of parchment paper upside down so your butter block won't touch where you've drawn. Using a spatula, spackle the butter within the lines of your rectangle. If your butter is still pretty stiff like mine is here, this step may feel a little maddening, but be patient and you'll get there in the end. Once you have your butter spread to fit your rectangle, fold over the edges of the parchment paper to secure your shape, and then flip the butter rectangle over so the folds are underneath. Next, use a rolling pin to gently press the butter to fill the corners and ensure that the thickness is more or less even throughout the rectangle. Put the butter block in the fridge until we are ready to use it, or at least 15 minutes. Now that our base dough has rested overnight or 8 hours, wow, look how puffy it got! It's time to incorporate our butter block. Lightly flour your work surface, your rolling pin, and pull out your dough. Roll the base dough to a rectangle approximately 12 by 20 inches or 30 by 50 centimeters. Now, I know this may seem a little crazy, the idea of pulling out a tape measure when you're cooking, but like carpentry, baking is an endeavor of precision, and after taking the time to make a nice butter block, we want to make sure we have an accurately sized landing zone for it. And honestly, I'm not going for 100% accuracy here, I'm just making sure I'm within a centimeter or so. Now that we have the size we want, partially unwrap our chilled butter block. It's a good idea to pull the butter out 4 to 5 minutes before you need it, as you want the butter to be a little pliable, not brittle. Place the open side of the package into the middle of the doughy rectangle, and peel away the parchment paper, gently prying the butter away if necessary. Once the butter block is in the middle of the dough, fold the top flap of dough over the butter, and then the bottom flap of dough up and over that. Next, using our rolling pin, press into the dough in increments. This helps ensure that our butter will stay even when we go to roll. Once we've pressed up and down along the length of our dough a couple of times, it's time to roll. We are again rolling out to a rectangle 12 by 20 inches or 30 by 50 centimeters. Once we achieve that size, we fold the dough exactly as we did before, bringing the top third down over the middle third and then the bottom third up over the middle. This is also called a letter fold. Now we refrigerate the dough for at least 30 minutes to let that gluten relax and make sure our butter isn't getting too warm. After 30 minutes, we pull our dough back out. On a lightly floured work surface, we repeat the same process as before. With the open ends of the dough facing us, we roll our dough to a 12 by 20 inch rectangle. And then our letter fold. Top third down over the middle third, and then the bottom third up over that. And then the dough goes back in the refrigerator to rest for another 30 minutes or overnight. I usually give the dough an overnight rest because I like the added yeasty taste that comes with a slightly older dough, but that is a personal preference. Our next 2 folds will be the same, except this time we will be incorporating sugar into the dough. I have 200 grams of granulated sugar, and because I love cardamom so much, I'm adding 5 grams of cardamom. If you don't like cardamom, you could use cinnamon or just go without spices altogether. So again, we are just rolling this dough out like before. In addition to lightly flouring my work surface, I'm also adding some of that sugar which will be worked into the underside of the dough. Now with the open end towards us, we roll the dough out to the same dimensions as before, 12 by 20 inches or 30 by 50 centimeters. Now sprinkle about half of the sugar mix over the rectangle of dough, pressing it gently to make sure it adheres. Then we fold as before and rest the dough wrapped in the fridge for 30 minutes. After the dough rests, we repeat the process the same as before. A touch of sugar on the work surface, open end facing you, roll out to a rectangle 12 by 20 inches, aka 30 by 50 centimeters. Take about half of the sugar mix, press it into the dough, and let her fold as before. Full disclosure, my camera person wandered off for the final fold, so this is just repeated footage of the 3rd fold, but I promise nothing scandalous happened. Your 4th fold will look the same as the 3rd. Then it's back to the fridge to chill and rest the dough one last time. While our dough is having its final rest, let's get our muffin pan ready. I'm taking some room temperature butter and using the most advanced tool in the kitchen, my hands, to rub that butter all around the inside of those muffin divots. Once they are nice and buttery, take the last of that sugar mix and sprinkle it all over. Give it a bit of a shake to make sure some of the sugar gets onto the side walls of that muffin pan as well. And one final touch to add to the professionality of our pastry. I have in the pot half a cup of sugar, half a cup of water. I'm going to heat that up just until the sugar dissolves completely, making what's called a simple syrup. And when that sugar has dissolved and the syrup is still nice and warm, I'm going to add about a teaspoon of cardamom. Again, if you're not on the cardamom bus, feel free to omit. We will use the syrup to give our pastries a glossy look after they've baked. Back to our dough. Lightly flour our work surface, open end to the dough towards us, and we begin to roll out. Roll out. This time we are aiming for a rectangle 8 inches wide by 24 inches long, or 20 centimeters wide by 60 centimeters long. Roll out just a hair past these dimensions, because the next thing we're going to do is trim the edges so that the sides of our rectangle are nice and straight. Now I know this is rather unorthodox to be using a knife to cut on a stone surface, but rock beats scissors, so oh no, I'm not damaging the countertop. Plus I'm good at sharpening knives. By the way, do not throw out the trimmed edges. They make a beautiful pastry in their own right. Once we have our clean rectangle, it's time to portion out 12 Kouign-Amann. Achieve this however you like. Using my ruler, I split the dough in half along the length first, then across the width. Then cut across the width every 4 inches, resulting in 12 squares of dough by the end of it. Just a note of encouragement, if your dimensions are a bit off after you trim your dough, don't panic. Just use your tape measure, pick a halfway point, pick another halfway point, divide that up. What I'm saying is even if your dough doesn't have perfect dimensions, work with what you have. Hell, you could even eyeball them if you really wanted to. Now for shaping. Supporting from underneath, simply bring the corner points together and place in the muffin pan. Give gentle pressure if needed to make sure they are secured, but avoid squashing them in. The side walls of the muffin pan should help keep the points upright. Ideally, the points should be almost like the petals on a flower. Just don't overthink it like I do most of the time. Speaking of flowers, just to gild the lily a little bit, sprinkle a tiny bit of sugar over the Kouign-Amann after you've fitted them in there. And remember those scraps we trimmed? With the cut edge facing up, twist them around themselves until you end up with a swirly circle of dough. This will bake a bit crispier than the others, but it's a great treat for the chef. At this point, you have to use your intuition. If you're quicker at working your dough than me and it's still a bit cold, let your dough rest on the counter for 20 to 30 minutes so that it proofs slightly and becomes ever so slightly puffy. It took me some time to work my dough, so it's barely cold at this point, so I'm just going to leave mine on the counter for about 10 minutes. Now that the mini proof is complete, it's time to bake. We go into an oven which has been preheated to 375 degrees Fahrenheit or 190 degrees Celsius. Bake for 25 to 30 minutes. All ovens are different, so keep an eye on them, keeping in mind you want them to look something like this. Aren't they gorgeous? And as if they weren't pretty enough as they are, take a pastry brush and paint the tops of them with that sugar syrup that we made. This will really make them glow. As soon as you're done glazing them, pop them out of the muffin pans and onto a wire rack. If you let them sit, all the caramelized sugar on the bottom will cool and lock them in place, and you don't want that. What a roller coaster this process has been. This is only the third time I've made them, but each time there's a moment where I'm sure the dough is screwed up beyond repair, but then somehow they just turn out alright in the end. In a lot of ways, making these pastries is like a symphony. Early on, a theme is established, like folding. Then there is a variation on the theme when we add sugar to the folding. And if you are like me, you have a moment where the music turns minor and you are convinced that all hope is lost and your internal monologue is very negative. But you power through, and in the final movement, it all comes together in a beautiful, triumphant finale. Anyway, I'm just gonna shut up now and show off these little ones like a proud parent.
Hey guys, I made it too.
You did it, you crazy son of a gun, you did it.
So thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because there's plenty more cooking videos where that came from. And if I made any horrible mistakes, please be sure to let me know in the comment section. Thank you and take care. Cheers.